actually realized this morning when I was looking for the room that we changed the title of the paper between the time we submitted.
Okay, yes. It's
so
a brand new title now?
Yeah, it's the new title. Okay. So it is still talking about lowering the environmental impacts in fashion, but we changed it to Green Synergy, a three-party fashion retail system balancing profit maximization and impact minimization. And I think throughout the presentation, you'll understand a bit more why we went with this green synergy and try to kind of align this three-party fashion retail system. So this project is my latest project in my PhD with Mehmet and with Robert Rudekert at Rotterdam, who's a collaborator that hosted me actually for 8 months in Rotterdam to kickstart this project. So a very fun 8 months in the Netherlands, beautiful sunny Netherlands. Okay, so I want to start this presentation by asking kind of a very simple question. That's the overarching question that we had in this project is how can we drive the transition to more sustainable production practices, right? Because I don't know how aware you are of the problems that are in the fashion industry and especially the fast fashion industry. But it's an industry that has been pointed as a major polluter in the past few years, in the past decade. It has gone from problem to problem, bad public policy, publicity, sorry. So there's really a lot of problems within this industry and bad public opinion, right? And this public opinion is increasingly asking the industry to change, right? Lowering its environmental is globally, but change the practices, change the material, buy more into this circular economy idea. But the problem remains that its environmental impacts, right, is very complicated. It's very intricate. It's multidimensional, and it's not really well understood by everyone that's involved in this industry, right? So consumers, retailers, legislators, anyone. Everyone has some kind of opinion of what is important, what is not important, what should be done first, what should be done last. But all of those things do not really align. So what that makes is that it clogs the whole system. It really stops any kind of meaningful advances in lowering the impacts. And also, one thing that's really starting to gain a lot of attention right now is that there are no current legislations, right? So there are no laws to really curb any kind of meaningful reduction of environmental impacts, specifically for the fashion industry. Right, so I've alluded to, and it says in the title, so we're looking at this three-party system. At a very high level in the fashion industry, you will have the consumers, the retailers, and the legislators, right? And all those three parties are kind of interacting with each other. They're sharing information. They're sharing, money, right? Consumers and retailers and whatnot. Each party should play a role, and ideally, it should be harmonious, right? Everyone should help everyone to kind of make this easier, better, beautiful sunshine and rainbows. But right now, it feels a bit more like this, right? Everyone's pointing at each other. It's kind of a hot potato tossing contest. It's who's responsible for this? No, it's not me. No, it's you. You need to do better. You need to move first, right? So there's really no alignment. There's no consensus. It's kind of everyone's pitted against each other rather than trying to come together to move this problems further, right? And why do I say this is, well, so the consumers, right, they if you ask them, they'll be like, sustainability, top, super important for me. Absolutely, we need more sustainability. We need it everywhere in all its flavors and iterations, right? So they are willing to do that, and they say it's super important, but it seems like they're not really willing to pay for it, okay? And that's something that the retailers have said over and over again. It's like the consumers are not really putting their money where their mouth is, right? And this is something that came out of a survey, right? The number one barrier to like a meaningful switch for retailers is low consumer willingness to pay for sustainability, right? And the two others are more related to missing regulations, and lack of consumer awareness. Okay, so already the retailer is already pointing the finger at those two other parties, the legislators and the consumers, like, well, you're not really doing your part. So why should we move, right? They have no incentive to change anything. And then finally, you have the regulators that are only starting to do anything. So the most advanced, I would say, region in the world is the European Union. They've adopted the strategy for sustainable and circular textile back in 2022, but it's only a strategy. So it's not, there are no laws. It's just an idea of like, we should do this, we should do that. And it still remains very vague in how they're going to do it, and how they're going to monitor it, how they're going to police it. Sorry. Okay, so they're all interacting, but they're not really seeing eye to eye. No one. And the result of this is that, well, consumers really have difficulty understanding and appraising environmental impact attributes, so therefore their willingness to pay is rather low for those sustainability things. The retailers, they don't really know what to do, right? They have no real incentive, and if they want to change, then they have very uncertain consumer preferences. They have costly new technologies to implement, right? Because there are technological advancement that needs to happen for this circular economy and everything. And I put here black and white thinking. And what I mean by this is that right now, what I'm seeing a lot from retailers, it's either they put no sustainability or they put all the sustainability, right? So it's a 0-1 kind of approach to designing products. And there's nothing really in between, right? So there's nothing that like a mid-level that can, create some kind of momentum and then move on from that. And then lastly, well, regulators are kind of caught in between, and they're like, well, what should we do, right? So they really struggle to kind of define good regulation, fair regulations also, that are going to be fair for the consumers, but also for the retailers. Okay, so that's kind of for the real world evidence, but also there is a little bit of literature on this. It's still very new. Most of the literature comes from marketing, especially looking at preferences and willingness to pay for sustainability. And what we see, the gaps in the literature is that there's no hierarchy in the features, right? So what's most important? What's most important for consumers? What's most important for retailers? What should be prioritized? What should be, maybe a low-hanging fruit, that kind of stuff. No robust willingness to pay studies. So, marketing is a bit more concerned with just like, they prefer this, they prefer that, but there's no real tangible kind of operational twist to those studies. Again, also usually binary levels for sustainability. So it's, do you want organic cotton or no organic cotton, or recycled or no recycled, but nothing in between. And there's a lack of research that measures how increasing consumer awareness might, change this, might help us build it. There's also a stream of literature that's quite new in operations management, that's sustainable operations. And in fashion particularly, it has mostly looked at theoretical models, okay? But very little data-driven. There's only one experiment that was done, and that's it, right? There's quite a good literature on electronics and stuff like that, but it doesn't really translate that well into fashion, because electronics and fast fashion are two very different types of products. So we're still at a very early stage in academic literature in terms of sustainable operations. And lastly, for marketing or operations, there's no real direct links to current proposed legislations, specifically, again, for the fashion industry. All right? And so you understand now what like this question that I've asked. Now I hope that it kind of it's starting to make a bit more sense. All right? Yeah.
How do you position this net zero emission targets that's imposed by United Nations?
Yeah.
Because of forget the name, like 2050 or something.
2030 and 2050 is supposed to be completely net zero.
Yeah. How do you position that one in the context of this these things? Are companies actually reacting, or are local organizations are?
Yeah, that can be, okay, so this is something that I've had a lot of thoughts about. So I think this should be a separate conversation, but I'm just going to answer this quickly by saying this has a bit more, less to do with operations right now, and a whole lot more to do with compliance. Right, so people now are looking at this, they're trying to build roadmaps to net zero by doing compliance, by looking like, okay, how did we do before? But year after year, just trying to change something and then looking back, right? They're not, I haven't seen yet, and I've talked to a few people in the fashion industry, and it's still, this mentality still hasn't translated into product design. And that's why I'm saying it's a bit more, it's more of a reactive interpretation and approach to this net zero than a proactive, where you would really try to develop the new products, or at least specifically to fashion. I don't know how it is in different industries, but for the fashion industry, they're not there. They're really, really not there yet. They're only scratching the surface.
So the net zero, is it specifically related to greenhouse gas emissions, or is it broader?
I think it's specifically, I'm not fully aware of the whole thing, net zero, but I think it very specifically looks at greenhouse gases, because the whole thing is with the 1.5 degree target, and necessarily the one thing that is plays the biggest role in climate change is the greenhouse gases. But because actually originally this paper was supposed to be looking at life cycle assessment things, and we were not able to get data, right? But so with the life cycle assessment metrics, it's easier to address those net zero, but you have, I think it's like 20 different ones. So greenhouse gas is one, but you have like water usage, you have release of chemicals in waterways, you have like release of chemicals, right? There's a super long list, but usually the one that's most convenient for companies to look at and for people, the public to understand, is greenhouse gas emissions.
Because there's a market that's not paid for it if they never need.
Yeah, and there's like carbon offset, and there's the tax that can be, so yeah, so this is probably, by the end of this presentation, you'll understand it, but this is probably a level lower than what we're doing with this, right? Because we're talking about environmental impacts, but we're not getting in the numbers really, right? You'll see, I'll get to it, but we say once you include an environmental feature in your clothing, you're just saying, well, it's going to reduce it, right? But we're not quantifying by how much. So it's just kind of a high level idea of this, right? Because it's also one of the first papers that's kind of has a data-driven approach that uses like a richer consumer behavior and prescriptive analytics. So that's why we kind of stayed at a higher level of granularity in our impact assessment, basically.
Just a related point is that indeed that the sustainability is much larger than just net zero, like and than the emissions. And
well, I
could even say not an expert here, but that the emissions, and that's part of the environmental impact, and environmental impact is part of sustainability, but sustainability is even larger than just
exactly. And this is why, like, I use it here, and if you read throughout the paper, I've been quite annoying with this, but I don't use sustainability, because to me it's like AI. When people talk about AI, it's something that's so vague, that's completely removing sustainability. Like usually people, when they say sustainability, they refer to the 3 pillars. So you have environmental, social, and economic, right? So we're specifically looking at environmental impacts, the environmental impacts branch of sustainability in that paper.
Thanks.
Okay. So in more details, what we looked at with this, right? The research question. So the first research question: what are consumers' preferences and willingness to pay for environmental attributes, right? So environmental attributes were specific, define them later, but they're really attributes that have the potential to lower the environmental impacts. Okay, so we use, for short, environmental attributes. Second question is, how is a retailer's profitability impacted by restrictions on environmental attributes, right? So there are no legislations right now. If legislations come into play tomorrow, what's going to happen to retailers? What's going to happen to their profitability, right? They need to plan ahead of this. And then the third one is, to what extent increasing consumer awareness can soften the trade-off between profitability and environmental impacts? Okay, so if we want to move beyond this, if we want to move further, what's an avenue that we can really go in that will really even promote further this green synergy between the three parties? And since we're adults, we'll start with the dessert, and then we'll get to the main course after. So what we found? So we found that consumers are insensitive to environmental attributes and that price is most important, okay? And that's going to become very clear very quickly when I start showing the result. 2, there is confusion between consumers' beliefs and behaviors towards environmental claims, right? So we are actually observing in our experiment what retailers have been complaining about, right? So which is a really, really cool result. 3, retailers can already offer marginal levels of environmental attributes without any impact on profitability, right? So already, even if most consumers are fairly insensitive to environmental attributes, they can still do something and it's not going to cost them anything, right? So everyone's better off. So the retailers can already, they should stop complaining and start doing, basically. 4th, increased consumer awareness shifts attribute importance and eases profitability environmental impact trade-off, right? So we are saying that it's increased awareness moves everything in the right direction. And then finally, fair policies need to be gradual, right? So I'll get to that a little bit more. I'll define what I mean by gradual. So together, I kind of hinted at it. We took this kind of marketing operation interface approach where we had an experiment where we collected data, and then we had like a prescriptive kind of framework that's kind of summarized in this very nice framework. I don't want to spend too much time right now. The whole presentation will kind of break this down quickly. But right now, what I just want to show with this is that, so the first part was collecting choice data. So we did a conjoint, a choice-based conjoint experiment to do that. Then we have our demand estimation that allowed us to understand better preferences and willingness to pay. And then we have our counterfactual simulation and optimization model with different constraints for legislations. And that allowed us to kind of characterize and quantify the trade-off between profitability and environmental impacts. Okay. So the first part, experimental data collection. Who is familiar with, I mean, there's only a few people here, but who's familiar with choice-based conjoint? Right? Okay. I was assuming it's going to be a very operations crowd, so I'll spend a bit more time to explain this. But it was important to us that we do an experiment because a lot of the environmental attributes that we looked at are not even available yet on the market, right? So it's not like we could have partnered with a company or a brand and asked them for data, sales data. It's just like it doesn't exist yet. So we had to do an experiment to do this, okay? The experiment had different phases. All the data that we collected was used, I'll get to this also after, but it's used to model consumer choice in our demand model. But we use the choice task to define the utility. We use sociodemographics and RFM, which is recency, frequency, and monetary value, and also the environmental consumption attitude question to model a bit more heterogeneity in consumer preferences. And then we have our increased treatment also that happened. And then at the end, we have an option, an incentive alignment mechanism that was put there to try to really, because it's an experiment, it's not real consumption consequences. So the mechanism is there to kind of make it a bit more real so that, especially for price sensitivity, we're able to collect like better data, if I can say it this way. Okay, so we recruited 489 people from the UK, 231 that went in the control group, 258 that went in the treatment group. And we recruited in the UK because this paper was very much focused on the new legislations that are trying to be put in place in Europe. But Europe, unfortunately, doesn't speak English. So UK was kind of the closest country that still has a very European mentality, but we didn't have to translate the questionnaire in 27 different languages. Okay, so the stimulus. So what respondents were presented with was a hypothetical sweatshirt from a fast fashion company, right? That we define using 6 different attributes. So the first 3 that we call base attributes, so the attributes that you would, expect to see or to look at when you go shopping. So you have bill of material, type, and price. Right? And then we had our 3 other what we call environmental attributes. So we have recycled content, durability, and circularity design. Right? And those 3 attributes are the 3 kind of recurring themes in the EU strategy. So that's why we put them there. And they also loosely represent the 3 different phases of a product's life cycle, right? So recycled content, and here recycled content is fiber to fiber recycled content, right? Represents more production, what you're gonna use the raw material to produce your garments. Durability will extend the use phase of your product, and circularity design is what could be promoted once as an alternate pathway instead of just throwing your garment in the trash bin. Okay.
Yeah. Question. Is there any relationship between software design and recycled content or other parts? Like, for example, I see design for recycling already implies something about the level of recycled content. So.
Yeah, so the circularity, it's a good question. So the circularity design, the way it was explained to the respondents was more if the retailer is going to actively promote a certain pathway. So yes, it has, there is a correlation between those, like a product with more recycled content may be less durable also, just because of the fibers. So those are things that are real. However, for this, we decided to kind of consider them in completely independent, just because it's easier. And actually, there's a nice result that we see there's very little correlation also in the part worth utilities. So, which to me means that the respondents also are not really seeing any correlation between them. They're just kind of, since it's new, they're kind of understanding them in vacuum also. But it's something that we point out in the limitations and future work that we need to kind of start modeling this. But then that gets tricky quickly if you start doing all the interactions. But yeah, it's a good question. Yes. Okay. So choice-based conjoint, just for quickly for those that are not too familiar. It's repeated choices that people have to do. So we put them through the 20 different choice tasks. And for each task, you will have 3 different alternatives. So here, 3 different sweatshirts and a no choice alternative, right? Saying like, none of them I would just rather keep my money. Okay, so we design hyper-individualized choice tasks. So you have 15 tasks that are for estimation and 4 that are for validation. So we kind of did the split. So we use a 15 estimation to calibrate our model, and then we tested validity on the 5 validation sets. And what I mean by hyper-individualized is that for the 15 estimation, each respondent had a unique set of 15 choice tasks to really try to cover as much as possible the different kind of attributes and level combinations. But the validations sets were the same for all the respondents. So that really allowed us to kind of test really well the validity of our model. And we also had applied a Latin square for the validation ones, so that each respondent that doesn't see the first one first always, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, and so on and so forth for all the respondents.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So here, you are presenting twinning to one particular individual. Those twinning. Do you think there is any spillover effect from, let's say, once I know 1, 2, and then maybe my decision may get affected when it comes to third?
Yeah.
Comparison and so on. So what did we do? By the way, what did you do to take care of the spillover effects?
Well, there's no real spillover, or haven't encountered that term or idea in the literature on this. Usually what they talk about a lot is being tired as you go through. So usually the later ones may be less reliable, but actually software, who's the main provider of to do this, of software technologies to do this, they have a white paper that says that actually people learn as they go. So the responses are actually more reliable sometimes towards the end, because the people are really starting to understand, okay, what really was meant by those attributes? What do I like more? So they learn more about themselves, but they learn more about the products and everything. So I guess that would be roughly what we're talking about with spillover, but because otherwise they're supposed to be independent kind of choice tasks, and because it's always the same product. It's always, you present the attributes and the levels at the beginning, so they know what they're getting into.
But we did also randomization, right? We kind of show different orders, different reshuffle.
Yeah, it's unique to every respondent, saw a different set of 15 estimations, I'd say. So.
These experiments, you sometimes give exactly the same, like you have 20 choices that need to be made, so you sometimes give exactly the same choice just for validation, or?
Yeah, so those guys are the same. So the shaded ones, so there's 5, that are exactly the same for all the respondents that we use for validation. In the design of the hyper-individualized sets, for example, this choice task may be shown to more than one respondent, but it's not going to be the first one. It's going to be somewhere, right? So it's reused, it's reshuffled. We actually use, we didn't use the Sawtooth software to do this. We actually designed them ourselves. There's a really good paper that kind of came up with this idea. So we that's what we implemented. I'm going to start going a bit faster because I think I'm already have a half hour done. Okay, so now that we collected the data, what we did to look at preferences and willingness to pay, so we have our demand model and we have our willingness to pay algorithm, and we also did a segmentation that's a bit more for the later for our economic analysis and counterfactual. So our demand model, so we assume that the choices, right, the respondents, they make choices following a hierarchical Bayes multinomial logit model, in which we define the utility for a product. So the utility respondent I attributes to product J for choice set K as the sum of all the part works. Okay, there's some fancy math here, but that's really just the sum of all the attributes and for all the levels of all the attributes that are binary coded. And then we separate between Bayes and environmental attributes, right? And then the hierarchical, to model further the heterogeneity, we assume that all the beta, so all the part work estimates, are sampled from a population distribution. That's a multivariate normal, with mean at that's defined with our sociodemographics, the RFM questions, the environmental consumption attitudes that we collected also in the experiment, and plus, if they were subjective in the treatment or not in the treatment. Okay, and then we have the priors here because it's hierarchical. So So what did we get? What came out of this, right? So if we do all of this, we used our stand to do our hierarchical Bayes, 4 chains, 4,000 burn-ins, and 4,000 posterior samples. So we had 16,000 posterior draws per respondent. And this is what we use to look at preferences. This is what we use to look at attribute importance, all the willingness to pay calculations. We always went back to those 16,000 draws. So attribute importance, right? So which kind of tells you what the importance of each attribute in relationship to the other ones, right? So what did we get? Well, it's pretty clear here that, you know, price is by far the most important attribute. Second most is bill of materials. And then we see that, you know, we say insensitive. They're not completely insensitive, but, you know, their importance is very, very, very minute compared to, say, price and bill of material, right? So that, yeah.
So they sum up to 100?
Yeah.
Okay, then a comment on that would be, yeah, but you have 3 environmental things. So if you would have 10 environmental things, then their individual effect would be even smaller, because together they still make up 30, let's say 30%, like more or less equal to the price.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could have chosen one environmental effect to focus on, you might have seen a different effect.
Yeah, that's true. And that's maybe a limitation of the attribute importance. And that's why I say that attribute importance is the importance in the context of the others, right? Because for example, if we had also discount here, I can tell you that price and discount would be top, right? And then this would be even further. So there is this in the design. Like there is a reason also why we have 3 base and 3 environmental, is because we wanted to have a balanced design. But you're right that depending on the choice of different attributes and whatnot, you would have that can fluctuate. We're not saying this is the truth. This is just, you know, but it's pretty good evidence that, you know, relative to those things that people usually look at when they shop. If you start introducing recycled content, it might just fly above their head because, you know, if it's cheap and it's discounted on top, then that's all that matters, right? Yeah. And then the second thing that I told you, the second result that was really interesting is that there's confusion in consumer specs, right? So what we see here is that durability is kind of the least important of all the 3. And then you have recycled content and circularity design, okay? At the end of the experiment, we had a question that asked the respondents, of the 3 environmental attributes, can you rank them from most important to least important for you, okay? And the results that we got is that people would say, if they asked the ranking question, they would rank durability as the most important. And then they would rank recycled content as the second most important, and circularity design as the third most important, okay? So there's a huge difference in, if you ask people what's most important for you, they're gonna say durability, but really durability when they're subjected to these choices, right? So those really harder trade-offs between all of those attributes, you see that there's a kind of a disconnect. There's a confusion. They don't see eye to eye. And this is well documented in the literature, this attitude behavior gap. So we see this also in our experiments, in our results.
Give another remark there?
Yeah.
The durability in itself, then for me, it's sustainability aspect, but it's also something that relates to the price in the sense, or at least the value to the customer. Because the customer will say, at least maybe not the high fashion or the fast fashion, but someone like me who says, okay, if I buy a t-shirt, if I can wear it for 1 year, or if I can wear it for 3 years, well, that will, in the long run, that will make a difference.
Yeah.
In my cost, in my total cost.
Yeah.
So it has an end. The durability as an environmental aspect also has an impact on the consumer, let's say, price set. I don't know whether it's price sensitivity, but at least if they think in more long term.
Yeah, but see, this is you coming with your own bias into this, because I can tell you that most people that are shopping fast fashion are not thinking like this. And actually, one of the things we put forth in the paper to explain this is that there is this temporal discounting that's happening, right? That people may not think like you. Actually, most people do not really think like you. And they're just gonna be like, well, I want it now. And that's it, right? And durability is harder for most people to value because it's discounted, right? You're really gonna see it in 1 year, in 2 years, right? Yeah. So I'm gonna skip quickly because I'm saying I only have 7 minutes. We also did willingness to pay. If you want, in the paper, we really describe this well. But the basic idea to measure the willingness to pay is that we kind of compare 2 products together. You know, you have a base alternative or like a status quo alternative and whatever you're interested in. And basically in the base alternative or the status quo, you know everything. And here you just know the only unknown is the price. And so you're saying, well, if you're a rational consumer, right? When do they equal? When does the utility of both equal? And then you're able to, looking with the part words and everything, there's some very simple math you can do. And then you can translate all those utilities, all those part word estimates into dollar signs. All right, and this is what we're getting for the willingness to pay. So even if we say that people are insensitive to environmental attributes, we see that they still have quite a good willingness to pay for those attributes, right? So if it's just like 2 products that are the same price, same whatever, but there is one has recycled content, then it seems like, yeah, people are actually, it's actually going to make a difference if you put in those environmental attributes. Okay, and then the last part of this paper is really kind of putting everything together, right? So we spend a bit of time to really kind of understand a bit better the consumer behavior, their willingness to pay for environmental attributes. But now we're really kind of putting it together into this counterfactual study and optimization, where we're bringing the demand function, so the richness of the consumer behavior that we have, the product line and pricing optimization itself is more from a retailer's perspective, right? So what's their optimal decisions, and then our optimization, our linear programming has constraints on environmental improvements. So that's to kind of model the potential legislations, sorry, that would happen. Okay. So very quickly, this is kind of what we had as a linear model, very linear program, very simple. We have our demand function that I said, Q and R, right? Because it's a joint product line and pricing. We're interested in seeing how they would price this. And our decision variable is, well, do you put it in or not, right? So the first constraint is you can only select 1 price per product version. The second constraint is we limit our assortment or product line to 5. Okay, 5 because we didn't want to deviate too much. The data we collected was for 3 products plus a no choice. So we're trying to not deviate too much of that because context of demand model is very important. So 5 was giving us a bit more products to look at, you know, the distribution of everything. While remaining in the realm of what we collected the data for. And then we have our environmental impact improvement scores for each of the 3 different environmental attributes we have, right? So the way it works, very simple, is each environmental attribute has 5 levels. Level 0 is the status quo. So it was given an improvement score of 0. And each subsequent level was given a score of 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the higher the score, the better it is for the environment, the lower the impacts. Okay, and again, going back to what I said earlier, we didn't really quantify this. We're kind of just leaving it at a high level. It's going to reduce the impacts. And then here we have a threshold that's saying, well, okay, so if you have some kind of legislations that's forcing you to have, say, 20% or whatever, then you put this, and this should force the retailer to have a certain level of impact reductions in the assortment. right? So what we see is that, as I said, right, there's a flat line here, there's a flat line there. So already the retailers, it's optimal to them for them to put in some marginal level of environmental attributes, and it's not going to cost them anything. Okay. And this is very apparent, right? So if you look at the completely unconstrained, so no constraints on the environmental impacts improvement, you see that the optimal assortment already has, you know, some level of environmental attributes. So that's why we say that, you know, they can do this already and they're not going to lose money. And then the last research question really quickly that we had is, what if we increase consumer awareness? So in our experiment, right before they went to the choice task, we showed about half of the respondents a very short video of 2.5 minutes. That was kind of presenting the environmental attributes, a bit like I presented them to you now, right? So very broadly, recycled content is into the production phase, and this is how it can help to, you know, reduce environmental impacts, right? So the respondents that were shown this video became a bit more aware of environmental impacts. And, you know, this is what happened to the attribute importance if you compare the two, right? So you see there's quite a significant and important decrease in bill of materials, and there's an increase in the environmental attributes. So we refer to this in the paper as the unpacking effect, right? So people are understanding that now they don't need to rely solely on bill of materials, right? That's usually what they use to gauge quality, but now, you know, there's more to it in terms of environmental and impacts and quality. And that has as an effect that it kind of eases the impact. Okay, here there's a slight decrease that's explained by people like more recycled content. So in the durability, there's usually a bit more recycled content from the start. So more constraints on durability will come a bit more at a cost. So overall, it helps, but you know, you have very minor. I think this, from memory, it's like 6% difference. So it's not nothing, but it's not a huge difference. Okay, and finally, fair policies need to be gradual. Why do they need to be gradual? Because it will allow the retailers to adapt their existing product lines. Right, it's important for legislators to not try to go too far too fast. And one of the results that we see that could help support this idea is that you know, as you increase the constraints on environmental improvements, you see there's a shift of bill of materials from purely from 100% cotton to including a bit more synthetic fibers. Okay, it is very unlikely that there's going to be any regulations on the type of fiber, synthetic or natural, but it's still something that you have to keep in mind, right? Because it's a cost-saving mechanism. Synthetic fibers are very much cheaper. So legislators need to think about that when they start turning the knobs especially for retailers. So kind of what I say, it also helps balance simultaneous restrictions, because what I've shown are results for, you know, if in vacuum, if you're only changing for recycled content or durability, but we also run interactions and we see that it doesn't drop quickly, but the interaction is also there. So it's important to keep that in mind. Enables prioritization between the different environmental dimensions, investments, changes, supply chain issues, you know, whatever. And it would leave a bit more time also for consumer education or increasing consumer awareness. Education might be a much longer thing, but just to make consumer a bit more aware of the issues. So that's it. I'm leaving you, there's a slight change in the question. If you see, it's not how can we, it's can we change. So I hope I was able to convince you that it is actually doable and that we can come together, everyone, and make the fashion industry a bit less impactful.